these are going to be the top decks right now, and it's Miracle Rogue along with Thief Rogue, and that's it. No, but in all seriousness, Rogue is dominating the meta right now. I mean, in Legend, which I think is the best representation of the meta because everybody is pretty good, but they also have enough dust to play different decks if they want to. 30% of people are still choosing to play Rogue, and in top 1K Legend, where people are playing most optimally, 45% of people are playing Rogue. And it just goes to show how much value and mana cheat really affects the meta. I mean, in Thief Rogue, you're able to get giant spells from Jackpot and big minions from Reconnaissance and reduce their cost. You can play big spells with Swift-Scale Trickster for free on turn 4. Wild Pawn Knoll is free when you are able to play the Potion Belt on turn 2. Queen of Shar gives you a cheap Colossal minion, and most of these cards you're able to replay with Contraband Stash and Tests. And then that brings us to Miracle Rogue, which is similar with the Wild Pawn Knoll. You are able to play it for free with the Potion Belt. This one relies a little bit more on Shadow Step Astalar, which is a ton of damage in the late game. You get giant 8/8 stealth minions with the Sinstone Graveyard on turn 3 or 4, depending on whether or not you have the coin, and it just snowballs from there. Rogue is ridiculously strong with insane mana cheat, but it will probably get nerfed soon. So this next deck is the only one that I think is moderately comparable to the two Rogue decks, and if you actually look at the play rate in Diamond 1 to Diamond 4, it's the second most played deck, Shocksplitter Hunter. It's even above Miracle Rogue, but that's because it's a little bit faster and simpler to play, which means it's easier to climb within that Diamond 1 to Diamond 4 range. For anybody who doesn't want to play a complicated deck like Thief Rogue or Miracle Rogue, Shocksplitter is going to be the perfect deck for you. You got insane damage from hand, you got good tempo so you don't get run down too hard early game. You still run Astalar, which can be a decent win condition late game if something happens to your Shockspitter or your weapons like a Rustrot Viper. You have Beastalk or Tavish as well for another decent late game win condition. This deck is just strong at every stage of the game, and I would highly recommend trying it if you want to climb. Next is going to be Quest Demon Hunter, which is the third highest play rate deck in the game in top 1000 Legend by a pretty wide margin. I mean, nothing else even comes close to these top 3 decks right here. The only reason why I'm putting it below Shockspitter Hunter is because most of you aren't as good as top 1K Legend players, which means you're not going to play this deck totally optimally, which means you're not able to judge hand size as well, how many cards you need to draw, when you need to commit to removal, and when you need to save it for combos and stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into the Quest Demon Hunter deck. So I will say that even though I think its potential is a little bit stronger than Hunter's, just barely, I think it is so much harder to play that it's just not worth it unless you're a Legend player. But overall, the deck is really good. Insane draw, insane damage potential. You're not going to end up getting your minions eaten or stolen with Mutanus or whatever because of the Soul Eater's Scythe. And overall, if you know what you're doing, this deck is just unstoppable. So the next deck on the list is going to be Freezer Burn Death Knight, which is just a really strong overall deck. You got good damage and mana cheat with the Glacial Advance and Horn of Winter, along with the numerous damage spells and minions like the Death Chiller. You can duplicate your hand with the Lady Death Whisper, which allows you to win games sometimes as early as turn 6 or 7. Without her, you'll usually win around turn 8 or 9. And then you also have giant board freeze and minion generation with the Frostwyrm's Fury, which just as a card shuts down any board-based deck. And then you also have decent tempo with a couple of good 1, 2, and 3 drops to help you fight for the board a little bit. It's just a really strong deck that has good direct damage, simple to play, and I would highly recommend it. The next deck on the list is going to be Big Spell Mage, which quite honestly is one of my favorite decks. I mean, I played it when the last expansion was out, when not too many people played it, and I went 19-0 with it. This deck got even better with the Arcane Defenders because it helps you deal a little bit better with the more board-based matchups, especially against a Rogue where they want to hit you in the face. You have these giant taunt minions their stealth minions have to get through, and then you also have decent freeze and removal with things like Reckless Apprentice, Varden, Mordresh, Rune of the Archmage. You have Disruption with Barbaric Sorceress to get rid of your opponent's cheap spells, as well as Okani, and then you also have decent survivability with Deepwater Evoker. This deck just across the board is pretty strong, pretty fun, but also fairly random because Rune of the Archmage is one of your win conditions, and yeah, it's a completely random card. So the next deck on the list is going to be Pure Paladin, which is probably the simplest and one of the cheaper decks on this list. The idea is simple. You just want to play a minion turn 1, turn 2. You want to pump them up with the Seal of Blood, Alliance Bannerman, or the Invigorating Sermon. Turn 6, if you can, you want to play the Blood Crusader into Countess, where you'll then play the Invitations turn 7, and then you'll probably win the game around turn 8 or 9. Oh yeah, Light Ray's probably going to be free as well, which is a pretty big minion. And if you don't have the Light Blade or Cariel, you don't really need them that much. You can run a Seafloor Savior for an extra 2-drop or maybe an Argent Protector. You can definitely play this deck on a budget. The only one that's needed is the Countess. So the next deck on this list is going to be Beast Hunter, and its win rate is very high on Hearthstone Replay, and from what I've seen online, it looks really strong. The only problem is the play rate isn't quite there. It's not as played as a lot of the other decks on this list, and from what I've seen online, a lot of the evidence is anecdotal, which means specific players are having good stories with this deck. But overall, if it's even remotely the same strength as it was last expansion, I would say this deck is good. So if you had this deck from last expansion and you're considering playing it, I would say that just go with it. It'll probably be a top 5 to top 10 deck in the game, which means that its win rate will definitely be above 50%. I just don't know if it has what it takes to compete with some of the absolute top decks. Next and second to last is going to be Curse Implock. You can also play Imp Warlock. I think they're pretty comparable in terms of win rate and play style. I just like this one a little bit more because if your board does get wiped and you're playing against a control deck, you do still have a potential win condition with the curses like Abyssal Wave, Zakul, the Cultist, Dragged Below, and Bran. Overall, the deck is pretty simple. You want to focus on the early game with the imps and snowball as hard as you can to do as much damage as possible, and then eventually your board will get wiped and you either regain it with Reform or finish them off with curses. It's pretty simple. And the last deck on this list is going to be my Dark Horse deck, the one that, even though the stats don't necessarily back it up, I feel is really strong. I went 13-6 with this deck, which is a 68% win rate, and it's the deck I personally used to get Legend. It feels really good. You have good early game removal, you have good survivability, you have Rust-Rot Viper and Vampiric Bloods to help you against Shocksplitter Hunter, you have Asphyxiate, which allows you to kill stealth minions, which helps against Miracle Rogue. You got really good removal and disruption with Patchwork and Theatar, which can help you deal with other decks like Miracle Rogue and just other control decks. You can disrupt them. And then last but not least, you have big board wipes with Soul Stealer if you're going against decks that generate big boards, like potentially a Paladin or a Beast Hunter. Overall, I just think this deck has answers to pretty much everything. Oh yeah, it also runs Aslar as a decent late game win condition along with Alexandra, so it's not necessarily even helpless. And then you have good resource generation with a ton of Discover cards, which can help you win the game as well. Overall, that's basically it for my list. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If nerfs and buffs do come out soon, I will be making a new tier list. But as of right now, these are the decks that I think are best. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.